my bipartisan bill, the Fire Grants and Safety Act, reauthorizes the U.S. Fire Administration, the Assistance to Firefighters Grant Program, as well as the Staffing for Adequate Fire and Emergency Response Grant Program through 2030. The bill would also increase authorization of appropriations for the Fire Administration for the first time since 2012. Dr. Morrell, can you share with us what the U.S. Fire Administration would do with these increased resources to better help protect our first responders who are preparing for these wildfires?
I appreciate that, sir, and thank you so much for shepherding that bill and for already passing those in the Senate. Yes, the U.S. Fire Administration needs the extra initiative, the funding, to be able to expand our own resources to prepare our firefighters across the nation to mitigate to be able to respond, and to be able to assist with recovery. It is imperative that we not only educate the communities, community engagement here has been made abundantly noted that the individuals are going to have to take responsibility, but it's our firefighters who connect with those individuals in their communities to teach them those things. And so we need that. We need the data. We need to be able to build a new analytics platform. Our National Fire Incident System was built in 1976. And so we need the funding to be able to build an appropriate data platform to inform this fire risk index that we have discussed. And so these funds are necessary to be able to elevate the USFA to an appropriate place where we can engage according to the recommendations in the commission. There are many there that talk about USFA's engagement at the community level with our structural firefighters across the nation, because they are the boots on the ground many times early on. So thank you for leaning into that.
Well, thank you for your answer. Mr. Fogerson, question for you is just how vital are these grant programs to local fire departments, especially given the fact that you are all finding yourselves on the front lines, protecting your communities, and resources are clearly stretched. But let this committee know how important these resources are.
Absolutely, sir, and thank you so much for the support of these grant programs. When I was the local government deputy fire chief, we had Assistance for Firefighters grants, and we had the Safer Grant program. When you look at especially the built environment, we're putting homes in these urban interface areas, but homes don't provide the tax revenue to start with. It takes a while for that tax revenue to catch up. And so when we put a subdivision in, we might not have the funding for staffing. These Safer grants have a cost shared from the federal government that varies over time that allows that local government to make that large investment. And I was able to do that. We had funds for 2 people, but we need 6 people to fill the 2 positions. And so we were able to use a Safer grant to hire the other 4. And then by the time the cost allocation came to 100% on our side instead of the cost share, we were able to absorb that in our budget. But we were able to, in that 4-year period, have 2 more additional firefighters on the streets, whereas we wouldn't have had that without that Safer grant. The Assistance for Firefighters grants, things are very expensive in the fire world. You're looking at a fire engine that we use on a wildland fire, Type 3 engine, costing $300,000 to $400,000. Our law enforcement partners get a lot of funds from the Department of Justice. Our public health friends get a lot of funds from CDC, ASPR. These are the fire services way of getting those funds for those high-ticket dollar items that are necessary to provide protection in our local communities, but might be out of the reach of some of these jurisdictions. And the competitive process that is used helps to ensure that we're giving it to the right places, I think, nationally.
Okay, thank you. Certainly the Maui fires are just a devastating example of how deadly these wildfires can destroy communities in catastrophic ways. And as a remote group of islands, Hawaii is especially vulnerable to disasters because it's difficult for resources to quickly reach the state when disaster strikes. FEMA has worked with other federal, state, and local partners to provide continuing relief and recovery to disaster survivors, with hundreds of FEMA staff deployed to Hawaii to assist in those local efforts. But Mr. Curry, my question is for you. You recently traveled to Hawaii to examine the recovery efforts. Would you mind sharing with the committee some of your top concerns for recovery at this point?
Sure. Yeah, we went there shortly after the fires hit and toured the affected areas. And a couple of them I mentioned in my opening statement. One of my biggest concerns after every disaster is housing for survivors. In a wildfire, it's 10 times harder than traditional disasters because you just, for many, many reasons. First of all, a lot of times these happen in remote locations and also in high-cost locations, whether it be Maui, California. There's not a lot of affordable housing that can be used temporarily or hotels or things like that. So I think in Maui right now, according to FEMA, there's still almost 5,000 people that are in some type of hotel or temporary condominium situation. And so also with a fire, you have to wait a lot longer. If you have a flood, typically you can get your house ready to live in within months. Possibly with a fire, it could take years. And you're fighting with insurance, you're trying to get federal assistance. So FEMA does a really good job with really short-term housing. And then HUD can come in on the long end, but there's this middle ground where people often get stuck and they just don't have a good housing option. So housing is one of the biggest things that I see as the challenge. And the other thing is debris removal. This is always a really tough part of any disaster, but with fires, again, 10 times harder. The debris is toxic. You have to figure out where you can take it, how it's going to be excavated. You can imagine a lot of this is privately owned land, so people are very sensitive about just excavating and removing their property. And in Maui, they just now figured out where they're going to store this toxic property and treat it. So those are just two examples of fire that are just way more different and difficult than traditional disasters. And our system is just not prepared and designed to handle that yet.
Mr. Curry, the GAO has issued a number of reports on the federal government's emergency management efforts on wildfires, on topics ranging from federal cooperation to manage growing risk, to barriers to recruiting, to retaining federal wildland firefighters, many others. So my question for you is, what are some of GAO's top recommendations for FEMA to better help communities prepare for, manage, and respond to wildfires? What should the committee know, and what can we do?
A couple things. First of all, back in 2019, we issued a report on wildfire response, and we actually identified some of the things we're talking about today and how unique the response was and how FEMA programs weren't necessarily geared towards that. FEMA developed a plan in response to some of our recommendations to try to change some of their programs to better gear themselves towards wildfire. There was some progress there. There just was not enough. And a great example is the housing one I talked about. So FEMA provides short-term housing when the federal government responds to a disaster like a wildfire. This is not really designed for the length of recovery for a wildfire that a survivor has to deal with. And there's not really a good option in that intermediate phase, which is what we're seeing right now in Lahaina and trying to find places for disaster survivors to live. So, we've made recommendations related to housing. I talked about the debris removal challenges, how they're so much different than hurricanes. But one of the biggest things that needs to be done is reform of the recovery process and the recovery programs. Because again, what we hear from the state and local level over and over again is that the programs were not designed to work together, and that leads to delays and oftentimes missed opportunities in disaster recovery.
Thank you. As we wrap up here, I'm going to have just a question, Mr. Fogerson and Ms. Adriani, if you would address this. And this deals with the Wildland Fire Mitigation and Management Commission report, which we mentioned had some 150 recommendations, so an awful lot to think about. But I'm going to ask both of you to prioritize some of those in your mind. There wasn't a prioritization in the report, but what things stand out for you? I'll do, Mr. Fogerson, you can start, and then give us some idea as to what we should be looking at. If we're drafting legislation, what should we be focused on?
Great question, Senator, and I'm sorry I don't have a good answer for you because it is such a wicked problem that's why there's 148 recommendations we made. It would be hard, and I would be remiss to tell you the top 3, the top 5, the top 10. I guess
top 11 then.
I would be looking at the themes that we have in the report, the chapters, and maybe seeing how we do legislation in each of those various chapters and grouping those things together, because one really has a nexus to another. We've got a great chart that commission staff made for us, and I'm sure we can share with your staff, that shows how interconnected all the recommendations are. So if you pick 3, then that eliminates a few other ones. So I would really highlight that staff looks at the chapters and sees about using that as their priority base rather than the recommendations.
Well, that's a good guide. Senator Ani, do you have top 10 list or top 5 or 3?
Well, I would concur with David that, they're all important. Excuse me, sorry. However, I did point to a couple in my testimony that I think are, lack of a better term, fairly straightforward opportunities that can dramatically change outcomes in communities. And so I would ask you to consider those, because I think they're policy level, some may, level opportunities to right size, the problem and address some very immediate issues that we have. So.
Okay, very good. In the interest of time, we're going to wrap up, but Dr. Morrell, I'm going to be submitting a question for the record for FEMA to kind of identify for us which recommendations FEMA is implementing on its own from the commission and which recommendations you believe require congressional action specifically. So I will be submitting that for the record and would look forward to seeing your response to that.